Ram Dass was one of my first spiritual teachers. I found him when I was 19 years old, and I would start listening to him in podcast form through the Mind Rolling Network when I was going for runs. So every night I would look forward to listening to Ram Dass on my runs and listening to him and his message. And Raghu Marcus, who actually does the Mind Rolling podcast. Mm-hmm. And it completely changed the way that I looked at myself and I looked at life. And Ram Dass has been a complete and total staple. He was my first spiritual teacher, technically. So he really inspired me to look within myself and start healing. And I'm very grateful for him.
What made you feel so connected to him at first? When you were listening to him the first time, what made you want to listen to him again?
Well, it's just what he was saying was true. Everything that he was saying, I didn't need to think about it. I just felt it. And that was something that I wasn't used to, because I wasn't used to feeling. I wasn't used to allowing myself to feel things and to feel from my heart. And when Ram Dass spoke to me, he touched me. He touched the part of me that knew that we were the same. We were one. And he started me on the path of service.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I first started listening to Ram Dass through Matt. He introduced me to the Mind Rolling podcast with Raghu Marcus and also Jack Cornfield with his teachings, with his heart-centered wisdom. And I really, really, really liked Ram Dass as well, because when I was listening to him, he was, very, very funny, and he always had some like comedic approach to his suffering and making fun of his ego, making fun of him, being separate from other people, and just how blown away that he was all the time. I really like his perspective on things, because
for sure
I can be very dark when it comes to my healing and my judgment of myself. And I think there's a part of Ram Dass where he actually was not as judgmental of himself, and that helped him be a really great observer.
And he was such a force of loving action in the world. And he used his stories and his comedy and his spiritual heart, his loving awareness, to help shift the world. And he would tell so many beautiful stories. And one beautiful story that he would tell was the man on the train. So there was a drunk man on the train, and he was experiencing a lot of anger. And he was swinging his arms, and everybody around him had to get out of the way. He almost hit an old lady. He almost hit an old man. He almost hit a child. And there was a Aikido practitioner in the back of the train. And that Aikido practitioner was just like, this is my chance. I get to finally use my martial art to teach the bad guy not to do what they're doing. So he stood up, and he blew a kiss to the drunk man. And the drunk man got angry, and he said, I'll teach you a lesson. And the drunk man went to charge. But then, to the drunk man's left, he heard a small voice that said, hey, over here. And a little old man was in the car seat where the voice was coming from. So the drunk man walked over and he said, what do you want? And the little old man looked at him and said, what are you doing? And he said, oh, I'm angry. I'm drunk. What's it to you? And he said, come, sit down for a second. Sit with me. So they sat together. And he got angrier and angrier and angrier. And then the drunk man started to soothe himself. He started to soothe down as the little old man slowly spoke to him. And he spoke to him about his wife and about his flowers and his garden. And he said, you must have a wife too. How's she? And he said, my wife left me. And he's like, I also lost my job. I don't know what to do. And at that point, the Aikido practitioner knew that what he was experiencing was just as hurtful to himself as the drunk man, because he actually got to witness loving action, Aikido in service. He got to experience the little old man do what he wasn't able to do with his physical action, just by being himself. And I think that was Ram Dass's message, that at our true nature, without anything, that we are enough and that we can help people transform their lives just by being who we are. And he tells plenty of stories like that, and I'll tell one more. There was a military commander, and this was in China. And this military commander was feared throughout the land. Nobody wanted to mess with him. And all the monks in the village that he was coming to had fled, all except for one. So now he walks into the village, and the villagers tell him that there's one monk left in the monastery. So the military commander barges into the monastery. He looks at the monk and he said, "Don't you know who I am? I could have your head. I could kill you with a touch." And the monk said right to the military commander, "Don't you know who I am? I could have you kill me, and I could die by your touch." And it's just sitting in the truth of those moments. Ram Dass was great at portraying that, sitting in the truth of when you're faced with something so incredibly terrible, so incredibly disturbing, and so incredibly horrifying to the body, to the mind, that you can always go to your heart. And your heart will always have the answer to help you find peace within yourself, to help you deal with your worldly troubles. Mm-hmm. And that was Ram Dass's message. He helped us deal with our worldly troubles through the spiritual heart. Mm-hmm. His final mantra up until his dying days was, "I am loving awareness." Mm-hmm. And he said that the last 10 years of his life, every single day. And, I know that he is in that place now, mm-hmm. with Maharaj-ji, his guru, with all the other great teachers, with all of our true selves. At the deepest part of our being, that's what we are. And he's there. Mm-hmm. And we can never forget what we never go away from. We just remember our true nature. We remember that place within us. Mm-hmm. It never goes away. Mm-hmm. It can never go away. Mm-hmm. We just pretend. We think that we're separate from it. We think that we're separate from the love of the Guru, from the love of Maharaj-ji, from the love of Ram Dass, from that place that we all come together to touch. But we're not. And what do you think you've experienced through Ram Dass's teachings in this way, where it's helped you get closer to your spiritual heart?
Yeah, I think the story that resonated with me the most was when he was sharing his experience with feeling angry with all of the devotees. Maharaj-ji's devotees were heading back to seeing Maharaj-ji, and they were going to go eat and, be together. And Ram Dass, for whatever reason, was feeling bitter or salty about being with the group. And he was like, "I'm not riding back with everybody. I'm just going to walk." So he had a miserable walk back when he could have had a little bit of an easier time with other people. And I can definitely relate with this, because there are so many times where I have chosen being alone rather than being with other people. And I think it's just, out of being separate and not willing to share that everyone is going through something, and you don't have to feel necessarily like glorified in being the only person, thinking that you're the only person that is hurt or going through hurt. Because even if we're all experiencing hurt, which is very true, but we can still all come together and rejoice and eat food and be together. So when when Ram Dass finally arrived, he saw that everyone was laughing and eating and having a great time. And I believe Maharaj-ji called him over, and he probably said something about, like, oh, you're back, or how was your walk, or something like that. And he was like, Maharaj-ji, I don't love everybody. And Maharaj-ji said, Ram Dass, love everyone and tell the truth. So even when, he said, but Maharaj-ji, I don't love everybody, he wanted him to remember, you do, because it's you being separate that is making you feel like that the heart and the soul doesn't naturally love.
Right, and he said, Ram Dass, do you love me? And Ram Dass looked at him. He looked at him, and he was angry when he was looking at him. He looked at him so angrily, and then he broke down, and he cried, because he couldn't hide any longer. He couldn't pretend to be angry with love, with God, with his true self. And then he looked back at everybody, and then he loved everyone. Mm-hmm. Because then he understood that he didn't have to do anything to love them. Mm-hmm. It was actually quite the opposite. Mm-hmm. He was actually doing something when he wasn't loving them. Mm-hmm. And that's the game that we play in life, with suffering. Like, we learn through our suffering, and we learn to feel separate, and we learn to hate, and we learn to feel bitter. Mm-hmm. But then we remember again that these are all learned things. They are all learned. And the process of unlearning these things is what we call healing. Which healing isn't actually necessarily healing, it's just unlearning. You're releasing. You're unlearning the things that have kept you from God, from truth, from Maharaj-ji. And that's our path. That's the path of anybody who's listening to this podcast. And it's a very, very challenging path. It's a challenging path, but it's also a very rewarding path. It's the path of the heart. And that was the path that Ram Dass lived every single day of his life. It was the path of service. And, the question that a lot of people ask is, well, what if I follow my heart and then I lose everything and then I don't get what I want? Well, when you're following your heart, there's nothing to lose, because your heart has no loss. Only the mind has loss. The heart is full. The heart is present. The heart is eternal. The heart is God. The mind is separate. The mind breeds thoughts of separation, of hurt. When the heart is leading the mind is when the mind heals, and the mind finally starts to learn its role and becoming the second in command. Mm-hmm. And the mind is a very good servant, but it's not a good master. It does a disservice to the body, to the soul, and to itself. Mm-hmm. And we're just unlearning. Remembering that there isn't really that much to know or to learn. To follow your heart and to fulfill your purpose, however big or small that may be, is just following your heart, following the truth of you. Mm-hmm. And I could speak for myself. I've had problems with that. I've had problems with grasping onto thoughts, holding on to them, and saying, no, this is me. I make my stand here. I can't do that. I'm not getting what I want. Where's my money? Where's my this? Where's my publishing contract? I've had problems with that. And then I've also come back into the heart and been like, wow, like Ram Dass says, what a trip. Mm-hmm. What a trip it is to go out and suffer and come back. Mm-hmm. Because in one situation you have your power, and in the other you have none. And you're a victim. Mm-hmm. And it's just about choice. Mm-hmm. Which one do you choose to stay in? Do you choose to have your power? Do you choose to do your work? Do you choose to feel empowered and be in the spiritual heart? Or do you choose to go back into the mind and suffer? Mm-hmm. And meditation, that's one of the tools that has helped me, and it helps millions of people get there. Mm-hmm. And it's about being. It's about being who you are. As Ram Dass says, be here now. Mm-hmm. And that was actually a quote from his trip to India with his guide, Bhagwan Das, who looked at him. Ram Dass would stutter on. This was right after he got out of Harvard as a professor, and he went on his first trip to India. He would stutter on about stories, about this, about that, trying to impress Bhagwan Das. Bhagwan Das would look at him and be like, Richard, be here now. And then Ram Dass would tell another story, and he'd be like, Richard, be here now. And that was his first encounter with unlearning all of the things that he identified himself as in India that was leading him to his guru, Neem Karoli BaBa. Which brings me to another question for you. What teachings, what feelings have you taken away from Neem Karoli BaBa, Maharaj-ji?
From Maharaj-ji, well, just the fact that Maharaj-ji was able to just basically teach all day, and he was able to serve every day, whether it was food or shelter and stories, and he was there for the people around him. He wasn't a professor, he wasn't working at the local gas station. Maharaj-ji was, from American standards, unemployed. And he didn't have a bank account. I don't think he didn't personally. Of course, I'm sure there was other things that they, I'm sure he's, felt money before and dealt with it in some way. But basically, yeah, he didn't, he just lived, he lived off of his service. And that is so hard to conceptualize in this day and age, especially, in more like Western culture. It's just so hard to think about, just doing your purpose without having there be attachment to, well, how is this going to pay the bills? And, already like your forehead's like crinkling, your eyebrows are furrowed. You're just kind of like, how is that going to work? And, Maharaj-ji that's why he was a guru, and that was his purpose. And for some of you who don't know, Maharaj-ji was actually married once. And, I think he got married pretty young.
12.
Oh, wow. Okay. He got married at 12. So, and then I'm not sure when he left his wife. But ever since he did, he knew his purpose, and it didn't have anything to do with money or work in the traditional sense, or I guess what we think is traditional, because actually how he lived is pretty traditional. It's of the heart, and that's timeless. So, yeah, that's definitely just him being who he was definitely a pillar for me, and always will be. And going back to Ram Dass, I can definitely relate to his overthinking mind, because like Matt said before in the beginning, he was a Harvard professor and he was a psychologist. So he was certainly not someone who didn't use their mind. He most certainly had a very, I'm sure he had a high IQ. But when it came to the heart, we're basically all on common ground, it's not about that. So him talking about how he was such a thoroughly studied psychologist, and he did it for many years helping people, and he basically thought, well, I pretty much could have the key to happiness because I understand human behavior, but there's a huge portion missing. It's like he said, he was like, I can't believe, he was reflecting on who he was and, where he was working, one of the most prestigious colleges. And he was still saying that there was something missing. And that's obviously where he began his journey to India, or his trip before he met Maharaj-ji. And also, I'm sure, I don't know if that's when he started working with Tim Leary.
At Harvard.
Yeah, at Harvard. But so yeah, I think we can all resonate with that. I think we can all, we can know a psychology book backwards and forwards. We can know the human condition and what makes us tick and everything like that. But sometimes there's this huge component missing if we're always intellectualizing everything. So I think that's something that really, that I understand that.
And Ram Dass, his main thing before he went to India was he said he would look into people's eyes and look at them and just like, do you know what's really going on here? And they would look back at him and they wouldn't know. And he would look at everybody's eyes and be like, do you know? Do you know? Do you really know what's going on here? Because he wanted to meet somebody who actually got what was happening. But nobody he met got it. And that was his journey to the East. He wanted to find a map of consciousness, as he said. A map of what was beyond the capacity of the brain to understand, beyond the capacity of Western education, of our system. He wanted to find the truth. And that's why he went out there, to find the truth, to get away from what he believed was true and what he was taught, and to learn hard truth, the truth that doesn't need any explanation. And when he met Bhagwan Das, he looked at him, and he looked in his eyes, and he's just like, oh my God, this 23-year-old kid in India, he gets it. He immediately, he finally saw what he was looking for. He's like, he gets it. So he started following him. And from that moment on, that was his true moment of aha, because what he was looking for was finally solidified in another person. So no longer was it a concept, a craving. It was a reality. Recognition, realization. Mm-hmm. And that's what led him to Maharaj-ji, to somebody who he finally found who was there, was fully present, was fully in the heart. Mm-hmm. And when he met Maharaj-ji, he finally realized that he was home, that his journey was over, that his problems had ended, because he finally came home to the truth of himself. Mm-hmm. He finally saw in another person what was always true in himself, the piece of him that could never die. Mm-hmm.
And another thing I want to mention was that Ram Dass also mentioned how he recognized that it's hard to be human. It's hard to walk around in a body. And he also mentioned that everyone is just God in drag. And that is true because, you know, when you look into someone's eyes, you know that there is a fully, there is a soul there, you know, and it might not necessarily match the exterior or match their words or their doings in life. Most of the time it probably doesn't unless they are living through their soul, which is beautiful. But he said, you know, I might have a car, but I'm not the car just because I have credentials, but that's not who I am. Who am I? You know, and that was the search that he was also searching for, or that he was looking for, because a lot of people might have that question, you know, who am I? You know, am I a pretty person? Is that how I identify myself? Do I identify myself as a 40-year-old man? Do I identify myself as a baker? You know, how do I identify myself? And then he said, you know, maybe a more honest answer is I identify myself as someone who is searching for truth. Or, you know, it might be I'm doing the best that I can. That is who I am. You know, you are not your things, you know, and that's why he mentioned the car, because a lot of people value their successes, which is very understandable. But it's not, if you find yourself doing that, you know, it's definitely worth asking the question, am I my things, or am I more of my spirit, which is trying to come back home to itself and understand what we are, who I am, all over again, with the suffering, with the pain, with the love, with the joy, you know. And I do like that he talked a lot about how difficult it can be to be human. And I think that we all have that difficulty because we have everything around us. You know, right now we're talking to you guys through our phone, which is sitting on a table, and we're sitting on chairs. And, you know, this seems all very real to us, but there's also a reality that we can't see. And just because what makes something more real, just because you can feel and see it, you know? So that's definitely something that I do appreciate, that kind of teaching, because I think that it kind of, I feel like he really got to people's level. He got on their level. You know, he was very relatable. That's the word I'm looking for. And I really, really love that about his teachings. And I think that that's where his comedy came into play as well, because, you know, some of the things that he said were just so true that they were funny. You know, we all understand what it feels like to be in your head. And so, that's what I appreciate about him. And he also, he came out with a movie, probably a few weeks ago, Matt, or a few months ago?
It was in theaters for a while, in some select theaters.
Mm-hmm.
It was called Becoming Nobody.
Yeah.
And it was about his journey of shedding his ego and becoming more of himself.
Yeah.
His limitless self.
Yeah.
And speaking of going back to the car,
mm-hmm.
how you talked about how, you know, people have attachments to these things and they identify with them. The first time he met Maharaj-ji after Bhagwan Das led him there, oh, I love this story. Maharaj-ji looked at Ram Das and he said, "That's a nice car." And Ram Dass said, yeah, thank you. He's like, you'll give me the car? And Ram Dass got so offended because he was just like, what? I'm not going to give you my car. What is wrong with you? Of course. And then Maharaj-ji just smiled at him. And Ram Dass was like, wow, like, he's already asking me for something, that a physical thing? What kind of a guru is he? And then Maharaj-ji looks at Ram Dass and he said, you were thinking about your mother last night, weren't you? You went out to think about her. And then Ram Dass said, what? How could he know that? And then he said in English, she died of spleen. And then Ram Dass's jaw dropped, and he went through all the possible scenarios of how he could have figured that out. And not one of them was real and could possibly be true. He went through all the CIA conspiracies, all the different conspiracies of how this little old man in India could have known that his mom died of spleen. But he also knew that he hadn't talked about his mom at all to anybody in India. So that wasn't possible. So there in front of him was a man who he now knew everything about him, every little detail about him. Mm-hmm. And he was looking at him with unconditional love. And Ram Dass just started crying. And in his book, Be Here Now, he said that he cried for 2 days. He cried and cried and cried and cried. And it was all a blur. And after that point, he felt that he had been cleansed. And he had finally arrived at his destination, and he was home. He was at home with himself. Because he finally got his answer. He finally got what he was looking for. He finally had his map of consciousness. And it was a little old man who was now sitting in front of him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that story. It's very funny because it also shows just how much, and Matt and I talk about this, how much Maharaj-ji, his teachings are very much done through like almost like pranking. He was very much of a little jokester, you know. He just really, he loved, you know, almost like getting under Ram Dass's skin to help him see some truths. And you know, don't you wish that someone just loved you that much, that they loved you that much that they could really play with you? It was almost like a divine, as Rumi says, a divine playmate. You know, someone that you trigger them so that you can help them remember their soul. And that's very much what we do to each other. That's what, mm-hmm. You know, Matt and I experience that as well, you know. So, yeah, a lot of people have stories of Maharaj-ji where they're just absolutely flabbergasted. Mm-hmm. Like, how could this guru be, you know, throwing apples at people? And, mm-hmm. you know, how could he be, you know, doing something like this? Isn't he supposed to be? And I actually did a video a very long time ago on YouTube. It was called What Does a Guru Look Like? And that was very much inspired by Maharaj-ji. Because, you know, I think sometimes we think that a guru might be this very refined and, you know, someone who's just going to teach us in a very calm way. And Maharaj-ji was certainly not like that at all. I mean, he was very calm in nature, but he was very fearless and
fierce,
also very fierce, but hilarious, absolutely hilarious. Because the way people talk about him is just, who have met him, is just wonderful.
Right. And there's a story that I want to tell about Ram Dass is one of his good friends, Krishna Das, who's an American who came over to India as well and became a now known kirtan singer who spreads Maharaj-ji's message and awareness. So there was Raghu Marcus, I believe Raghu, if he listens to this. I believe you were in the room. Don't quote me on it. But it was a bunch of Maharaj-ji's Western devotees and Krishna Das. So they were all in this room, in this hotel room. And then Maharaj-ji walked by and looked in. And then Krishna Das looked at Maharaj-ji, and Maharaj-ji looked at Krishna Das. And then Maharaj-ji came and sat down. And then Maharaj-ji, without any introduction, says, Krishna Das, courage is a very big thing. And Krishna Das was terrified because he was just like, well, what's going to happen to me? What's going to happen? where am I going? What's going to happen to me? And he said, once again, Krishna Das, courage is a very big thing. And that didn't really hit him hard until years and years later, when he went through a lot of personal, challenging overcomings and healings of his suffering. And then he heard in his head, Krishna Das, courage is a very big thing. Mm-hmm. And that acted as his way forward. Mm. He could get through anything with Maharaj's words in his head.
Yeah.
And that was his story of overcoming fear with the Guru's grace. Mm-hmm. Because Ram Dass says this as well. To know the self, it's better to find someone who is realized and to look to them and talk to them and try and find truth through them than it is to stay in your mind. Because at least they're the doorway. They're the doorway for you to get back to your true self. And when the devotees, the Western devotees who came over, met Maharaj-ji, they found the doorway. And a person was a perfect, clear channel for God to act through and to be present. And also a very loving human being who also lived a very dual life. Mm-hmm. And they got to see that, yeah, Maharaj-ji was the divine. He was a clear channel for God and the divine to flow through. But he was also a man. And he was also somebody who was very relatable, very fun to be around, and was human. Mm-hmm. And that's the thing about relating. That's the connection there. Mm-hmm. Someone cannot be a doorway for you unless you can relate to them. You feel what they're saying. You know what they're saying carries truth. Mm-hmm. And it's a lot easier to hear truth from a man sitting in front of you than it is to hear your own inner guidance sometimes.
It is true.
And that's what they were looking for. They were looking for a man or a woman to give them guidance from the heart, from God. Mm-hmm. And that's what they received.
Mm-hmm. All right, everyone. So I hope you enjoyed our stories and what we had to share about Ram Dass and his guru Maharaj-ji. Please, if you haven't already, check out the Mind Rolling podcast. They have some lovely channels on there. I think one of them is called Heart Wisdom with Jack Cornfield, or Podcast with Jack as well. They just have wonderful, wonderful tools where you can listen. I mean, all you have to do is listen, and there's just so much love and peace and awareness in what they do. And Ram Dass also has a foundation called the Be Here Now Foundation.
Love Serve Remember Foundation.
Thank you. Love Serve Remember Foundation. So that's there as well. And you can find Matt and I on our Instagram. We post poetry. We post our own original quotes that help motivate the soul and your purpose and your heart. So we have that on our Instagram. I will link that down below. And you can also visit us on our website, thespiritualspruce.wordpress.com. If you feel motivated to send us an email or a message on how much you like the podcast, what you would like to hear from us in the future, you can certainly do so by emailing us at thespiritualspruce@gmail.com. All right, everyone, thank you so much for listening.
Thanks, guys.